All right, welcome back to another episode of Curiosity, Not Judgment with Birga and Gary. You may notice we're in the exact same clothes. It's because we just wrapped our last conversation moments ago and we're pretty fired up and needed to continue on.
Yes.
So, we ended last episode talking about work issues and what happens with a workforce that is difficult to bring into your place of employment. You need qualified workers. You've got stories, I've got stories. One of the most fascinating things that I'm dealing with right now professionally is I've been asked to conduct these interviews with HR managers and with employers in communities where they're really struggling to get people to come to work. So I'm in places, I'm not physically going there, but doing a lot of Zoom meetings, places in Tennessee and in Maryland and other locations where there's a lot of manufacturing plants, there's a lot of warehouse type positions, and they can't get people to take the jobs. Industries are being crippled by this lack of workforce. And so I am now in the mix of this conversation with employers that I never would have dreamed of having 10 years ago. And it goes a little something like this. Hey, boss of the factory, would you be willing to reconsider some of your non-negotiables in your hiring practices so that you can get people to come to work? It floors me that we're having these conversations, but that is really where we're at, because 10 years ago, it may have been out of the question to hire somebody with a felony, a previous felony. Would have been out of the question to hire somebody with a drug arrest. It would have been out of the question to hire someone with, list your top items that you can think of that 10 years ago would have kept you from getting a job. But now there's so few people to go into the workforce, and that's a whole other conversation for a whole nother podcast. There's so few people, there's having to be these conversations about, could you maybe not judge those items that you thought before were deal breakers so that you can have someone show up to get your job done?
Mm-hmm.
It's big stuff, and this is very real right now. And there's positive aspects of it without a question. I love that we're having to reconsider hiring somebody with a previous felony, because if that felony happened when somebody was 19 years old and stupid and just they were being a teenager and caught up in the moment and their actions led to this, I'm not saying there's not consequences. I'm not suggesting that at all. But should that brand cause them to be judged for time and eternity in the workforce? So there's a positive element to some of this, right? But there's also parts of this that I go, oh, wow. If you show up to work high once, is it okay? If you show up to work high 5 times, is that my breaking point? And so these are the conversations that are happening right now in the workforce between HR managers and company owners and economic developers, etc. It's a wild world right now. And so I know you've got some stories about interactions with employees, and so let's talk about curiosity, not judgment at the workplace.
Okay, so backing up to 100,000 foot level, you're talking about hiring new employees, and that there's a lot of assumptions and a lot of stuff in there.
Right.
First of all, why don't you have enough employees now? And from 100,000 foot level, there's a couple of aspects to this. One is retention of the current employees you have, and I've got a lot to say about that. The second is what are your hiring practices and standards and why, right? And then you can talk about, okay, what are the pools of people out there that you should consider, and what are your recruiting practices, different than your hiring practices. Recruiting,
Yes.
in other words, how do you get them to even come to the door?
Right.
So let's say that there's those 3 items, okay? So starting with retention, we know that money seems to be the big one that's out there right now. And there's all kinds of things about, well, if we paid people more, then they'd be more willing to work. And money over and over again in the surveys and the psychological things, that the tests that they do, is not the prime motivator. The prime motivator is meaning in their work. And meaning and challenge is a close corollary to meaning. And I think making sure that we have meaningful work and that people understand the meaning of their work and how what they do contributes to the overall goals of the company is a huge part of it. And constant training and edification of the people at work is a big deal. And I remember the old adage of, what if you provide the training and your employees leave? And the answer is, what if you don't provide it and they stay, right? And so I think that making sure that we're communicating with our employees, finding out who they are, what their motivations are, and matching those motivations to the work that they're doing, etc., is a huge issue. And finding out why people are unhappy at work, if they're unhappy or if they're considering to be just a paycheck or just a job. I'll never forget coming back. I was at Intel, and I had an employee that I was giving a review to that I didn't know. This happens sometimes in large organizations where I was in another country and I was flying in to give reviews to people who worked for me in my group that I had not met yet. And so I got this one engineer, and he sat down across the table from me, arms closed, body language, just, you could tell he was thoroughly disgusted with the whole process. I just put the review down and said, so what's going on with you? These things are so stupid. Oh, what's stupid about them? Well, they never reflect anything, all my performance and what I've done. They just, it always says the same thing. And I said, okay, tell me what it says. Well, it says that I'm a great engineer and I'm good at project work, but I'm a terrible communicator, so here's your 2% raise. And I said, it does say that. It says you're good at projects, it says you're poor in communication, here's your 1% raise this time. And he says, see, it always says the same thing. And I said, so what's your assessment of this? He said, I'm a good planner and I do my projects well, and why isn't that enough? And the whole thing is just, it's all they've sent me to communication classes, nothing works. And I said, okay, so I guess we're done here then. And he goes, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, if you don't want to hear, my thoughts or anybody's thoughts about how you might improve communication, well, we've tried everything. Okay, I guess we're done.
See you later.
Well, do you have an idea? Well, yeah, I do. And he goes, well, what is it? I said, well, it says here that you're good at planning and you're bad at communication. Have you ever thought about planning your communication? And he's just like light bulb. And we spent the next, what does that mean? Okay, you've got people who work for you, you've got your peers, and you've got management. Each audience is a little bit different. They have different needs. If you plan your communication and plan out, anyway, by the end of the conversation, he left the room with hope, right? And this guy who was just about to quit, the next time I saw him, had gotten a promotion and was doing extremely well because he sat down and planned out his communication. He used a strength to cover a weakness, and it took someone, like we talked about last time, from outside of himself to point out something that he could have, with a little self-examination, come to his own. Anyway, that's one example. I'm just saying that if we were to be creative about the way we lead people, not manage them, and be, you have to be effective with people and efficient with things, then we could do better at retaining the people that we have and growing them, because that's, we all know that turnover is terrible, and now finding new people to replace the old people is really, really tough. So I would start with the retention piece. Then there's the hiring practices thing. I think it's interesting that we are now saying, okay, we need to broaden the pool, and we can now look at felons. I'm involved with an organization called Wings for Life, as you know.
I do.
And I'm very, very supportive of what they're doing. And another group that I support is called Fathers Building Futures, and these are people who've come out of incarceration and giving them a chance to to have work, they do deserve a second chance.
Yeah.
There are certain constraints. I used to run a healthcare business that put caregivers into people's homes, and there's certain things that are just not okay to do, even if you're trying to help. And,
Right.
and you can do that. But there are what we used to call bona fide occupational qualifications, and we can be a little bit looser with that than probably historically has been the case. And I think we should give second chances on that. You do, though, necessarily, and this is just like parenting, you have to have very logical consequences for certain actions. You have to be very clear what those expectations are up front, and then have very clear consequences for those, and then be very consistent in the application of those.
Right.
And I think now what we can do is discuss what those expectations are, and we can discuss the consequences. But those still have to be there. You bring up coming to work high. Look, if you're a truck driver, I'm sorry, it has to be zero tolerance, right? In other situations, maybe you could play with that. But the key is to be very consistent on the expectations, and then very consistent in the consequences that are resulting from those expectations, and then apply it consistently. Parenting, you do it over 18 years.
Right.
In an employee's life, you do it over the case of the employee. But I think it's always good to constantly be questioning, curiosity, not judgment. What is those current hiring practices?
So I was going to say, I'm going to push back a little bit, but maybe it's not a pushback as much as a yeah and. So as you were saying that, my thought was going to some of the conversations I've been having about, have you heard the concept poverty IQ?
No.
Have you heard that? So poverty IQ meaning how well versed, in this case, is an employer about the nature of poverty. How well do they understand what poverty experiences lead to in terms of crises and situations that would impact their employees. And so this is one of those areas where I'm learning about how critical curiosity, not judgment is, especially when you've got a workforce that you're trying to introduce into a work culture that maybe it's not a good fit initially. Maybe there's a whole lot of culture dynamics that need to be worked through, and how important it is for management to really begin to start asking questions and not jumping in with judgments. Because I'll give you some examples. So one of the maybe previous non-negotiables was timeliness. So let's say it's a factory setting and there's a new employee and they were late on day 2. 10 years ago, that would have been grounds for dismissal. But now, asking questions, broadening that poverty IQ, learning about what families are dealing with that have been in generational poverty, causes there to be this pause and say, okay, let's find out why that person was late, instead of making a judgment that they're a lazy, good for nothing, and dismiss them. And the reality is they have a 20-year-old car that works on occasion, and that morning it didn't work, and they were late. And so how do you then, as the factory owner, the HR manager, how do you begin to ask the right kinds of questions to get to the root of the issue? And then how do you change your work culture to help support somebody where they can't do anything? They can't go out and buy a new car. They can't do anything about the fact that their child was sick and they can't take them to daycare when they're sick, and on and on and on and on. And these critical pieces that are drastically impacting somebody's ability to perform at work, where again, 10 years ago might have been instant dismissal, but now hopefully there's opportunity to ask meaningful questions to understand what's going on with that employee.
Sure. Again, this varies from workplace to workplace and job to job.
Yeah.
In our situation where we were doing home care, being late could be endanger someone's life.
Yeah.
And so we used to have to ask the question, and I didn't ask, how's your car? I said, here are the hours, the shifts, the things that you're expected to be at. Do you see any reason why you couldn't be here at this time? And if the answer is no, then That's the expectation. And here's the expectation on, how late you can be. And sometimes they're taking over for someone else.
Right.
10 minutes doesn't matter. An hour does.
Yeah.
Because you've got burnout from the end of a shift.
Sure.
Or other safety concerns. And so it does vary from place to place. I think it's also very important, look, you can't teach a duck how to run a marathon, right? So you have a situation here where you have, there's certain, again, back to the BFOQs, and maybe this is too old thinking, I need to reevaluate.
I don't know what BFOQ is.
Sorry, bona fide occupational qualifications.
Okay.
So, and we can rethink those, of course, and we can do it per job. But if you have a situation where tardiness is okay. It's okay if someone's a little bit late for this job, as long as they get the work done in this 24-hour period. And we're seeing a lot of that by, it used to be that people didn't think people could work from home.
Right.
Well, now everybody's working from home.
Yeah.
Right? And how are we going to manage people at home? Well, now we're creatively figuring out how to do that, right? And in those situations, it's fine, right? But there are some situations where people, unfortunately, need to be on time for work, and they have to be on time every time. Southwest Airlines, I know a couple of people who are flight attendants there. You're late one time during your training period, it's instant termination. Sorry, because flights have a lot of people on them that need to go places, et cetera.
On time, yeah.
And so, unfortunately, someone who isn't going to be able to get to work on time for whatever reason, isn't going to be able to fulfill that position.
Sure.
Hopefully there's other positions they can.
Right. So let's real briefly talk to employers or managers. You've done much more of that than I have in terms of managing a workforce. How would an employee approach you in a way that you would possibly reconsider some of your positions in order to accommodate some of these stressors that the workforce is facing? And I'm not talking about, approach me between, 6 and 9 a.m. when I'm fresh. I don't mean it like that. But how would somebody pique your curiosity as a manager to take a pause and step back and say, all right, maybe I could reconsider this policy, or maybe the parameters for this could be loosened up? How could somebody approach you in a way that would cause you to be curious?
Well, the first is to approach, right?
Yeah,
The answer is always no unless you ask.
Yeah.
I think that we all make a lot of assumptions in life. And I think many people will quit a job with or without notice based on the fact that they just assume that something would be not permissible. So the first thing is to ask.
Yeah.
So if I get somebody who's coming to me to ask me something, of course I'm going to listen.
Yeah.
And if they make a logical argument that isn't going to be seen by everybody else as unfair or setting a precedent that is intolerable for that work, then of course we're going to make an accommodation.
But I know you, and I'd say, yeah, it's Gary. Of course you can approach him, because I don't know that everybody is as agreeable as you are. And so for somebody who's a rule follower, somebody who's really wired in that personality trait, like, they're rigid, they're in that space of my way is the way, and that's the way it's going to be. Is there hope? Are we just, I don't want to judge those people for sure. How do we be curious about these different personality types and approaching them in a proactive way?
Sure. Again, the first thing is to approach.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to try to think, okay, you've got reason mind and emotional mind, and the intersection is wise mind, right? So you have to think about, I've got a situation right now where I've got a person I need to approach with something, and my inclination would be to come in ready to go with all the logical reasons why this should be. But another person wiser than me said, no, you've got to address the emotional part first. They're going to feel like you're stepping on their toes. They're going to feel like you are usurping some of their power if you go at them with all the reasons why, without acknowledging first that they are the decision maker in this situation. They are the ones that have some power, perceived or not.
Yeah.
And they are the ones. So I think it's important to think about, okay, do I have to approach the emotional part first or the reason part first? You have to do both at some point. That's the wise mind, which is the intersection of the two. But it's really important to understand how to approach a given people. We sometimes think, okay, look, I'm right, and so therefore it doesn't matter how I approach the situation because I'm right. Guaranteed failure.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
I mean, the creative, the choice, the curious part of this is, how might they best receive this? And I think that's the whole key.
Yeah.
We all deal with people. Okay, this person's a rule follower. Great. Let me come with another set of rules that could replace this one rule that would equal the rule follower's rule-making capabilities, right? I mean, there's ways to approach different people in different ways, right? And I think that's the key is, don't get stuck in your singular approach. Don't have only one arrow in the quiver. Have several. Develop different kinds of ways and approaches for different kinds of people.
Yeah.
That works whether you're the leader of a group of people or whether you're a person approaching your leader or your manager. And I think it works with anybody you meet on the street. You know, I always say, don't be on your cell phone when you go through the line at Smith's.
Yeah.
Or Target.
Right.
It's just rude. That's another human being there. We should be interacting with those people.
Yes.
And so, but if you've got somebody who's got their head down and they're not, hey, how's it going today? Yeah. Boy, it's a long line. Does it ever end? I mean, there's ways to approach people in ways that are engaging that will work with anyone.
Yeah.
How creative are we in figuring that out?
Well, and I think that is maybe a good place to kind of park for this particular episode, is really thinking through some of those questions that can draw someone out of whatever shell they're in, whether it's the rule following shell or the downcast, isolated, I'm in my own world shell, to have some very specific questions to bring forward to prompt somebody to say, hey, I see you. I choose to care. I'm not going to make a judgment about this particular situation, but instead I'm going to engage in a way that makes you feel valued.
Exactly.
And so whether that be your employee, your employer, or somebody at the checkout line, to be intentional. I think it just starts with treating one another with human kindness and dignity, right?
Exactly. And people deserve that respect.
Yeah.
Right? Call them by their name. Talk to them. If you've made the effort to approach them in a way that they understand, people say, well, that person's not approachable. You haven't tried a way that makes them approachable, right?
Right.
And just the effort of doing that. Whenever I used to go to a foreign country, I would do as much as I could. I would launch into presentations in their language. They saw the effort and would say, okay, our English is better than your German. Feel free to, let's have our conversation. But making the effort is the key.
Right.
And people see that and recognize it. It goes a long way.
Absolutely. All right, so I think that's a good place for us to wrap for today.
Good.
But another stimulating conversation, so let's keep them going. Feel free to send us topic ideas or, again, any area where you want us to just dive into a little bit more deeply. curiositynotjudgment.com. Gary, as always, thank you for your time.
Until next time.
All right, see you then.